All right, good morning, good Monday morning. It is marching on in the semester. We're on day 17 of class. There's only 31 days of class, so that puts us more than halfway through, almost 2/3 of the way through. So it goes by quick. It'll go by even quicker as we get closer to finals because you guys will all be stressed out about your other classes and you'll forget all about me. But hopefully not entirely about me, and hopefully you'll still learn a few interesting things. So today we're going to talk about logo design. We've got a couple Illustrator lectures left. Today will be about logo design. Next class will be about color theory, though that could take a whole semester if I was really doing it, so it's the abbreviated color theory. We do it in one lecture instead of a semester. And then after that we'll do architectural diagrams, which are like brushes and that sort of thing in Illustrator. And then we'll move into AutoCAD for a day, and then you have spring break. So life's pretty good, right? So spring break's in 2 weeks. You guys get to take a week off, which is excellent. I get to take a week off, which is even better. So anyway, we're going to push through. We're going to do a little bit more Illustrator, get that wrapped up. The Charlie Harper is due. Let's make it due the Wednesday before spring break. Okay? So that way you're done when you don't have to think about anything over spring break. Does that sound good? I think I might have said Monday somewhere, but let's do it Wednesday. And then you turn it in, and you go off on your merry way for spring break, and there's nothing hanging over your head, at least from my end. Okay? So I am nice like that. Remember that, right? I try to think through things. So let's talk about logo design, and then we'll deal with some special tools in Illustrator that may help you out. This is something that you're already really familiar with because every day that goes by you're bombarded with logos and you see them all the time. Some are really good, some are really clever, some are not so good, but you still see them all the time. Okay? So if you have an effective logo, it's something that's very distinctive, something that's very recognizable. The best logos out there are very simple and very known. And we'll go through some of those. It should be appropriate for whatever it is that you're doing or whatever field it is that you're in. It should be relatively practical. It should be kind of graphic, something that stands out, something that's easy to recognize, that sort of thing. And generally they're very simple in form. If they're too complex or too hard to repeat, it takes away too much from the logo itself. And I'll show you a bunch of examples. And generally it's going to convey some kind of an intended message. So let's look at some of the very common logos. Shell gas, right? It's a shell, not a surprise, right? But it's very iconic, right? It doesn't say anything about shell. It doesn't say anything about gas. But if I showed it to you, every single one of you would know that's a gas station, right? So it's a very recognizable, simple signal, simple logo. 2 colors, right? But at the same time, I could have picked Chevron. It's the same thing. The only difference is Chevron actually says Chevron. But it has the little, the same little thing. Volkswagen, right? VW, it's a very subtle bit of text in there. There is a V and a W, but it's kind of an iconic logo, right? NBC with their little peacock is also a very iconic logo. They've stripped off the NBC part quite a lot now. Most of the time you just see that logo. So they're simplifying things. ABC, again, kind of as simple as it gets, right? Chanel, whatever. Whatever. It's in there, right? Rolling Stones, kind of an iconic symbol. A little bit more bizarre, so to speak, but it is kind of an iconic thing. Starbucks, right? Do you guys remember before Starbucks existed? Yeah. A few of us might be old enough for that, right? Now, this is probably one of the most common symbols we see in a day. Right? You can't go very far without this. And it's actually kind of interesting if you stop and think about it. Most of you see it as this green circle with a lady in it, and you move on really fast, right? But if you actually start to look at her, it's kind of a creative symbol, right? One color, right? Very high contrast, but at the same time very recognizable, right? It's very memorable, right? Which is kind of the thing. And it can also scale really well. Here we're looking at it in a really large format, and it's still interesting, right? If it's on the side of your coffee cup, it's much smaller, but it's still interesting, right? So it's scaling really well, which is very useful, right? I'm going to show you some of these. Some of these are blurry, and I apologize because I don't have the high resolution ones, but some of them are just really entertaining, so I can't not. I have no idea what these companies are, but they look fun. Right? The other thing about it is you want your logo to be enduring. Okay? And if you think about logos and you think about the big logos, the ones we've already talked about, for example, Shell, right? NBC, right? Those have been around for 50 years, maybe longer, right? So you want to think through, how is this logo going to endure time? Is it going to look old? Is it going to look funny, right? You want to think 10 years, 20 years, even 50 years down the road, because if you have a very successful company, right, that company is still going to be around, and you want the logo to still be reasonable. So, right, in 1976, this was Apple Computer's logo. Okay? That would not have withstood the test of time. Right? So in 1977, they said, maybe we should change from this logo, right, to this, which is the very first of a very iconic set of logos, right? And so they went from 1976 through 1998 with the rainbow Apple logo, right? So if you were born yet, it's scary that I can say that now, right? You might remember this logo. I remember this logo, okay? Then from 1998 to 2000, they switched and just did the black, right? Very, very plain. And we're not talking color theory yet. I'll come back to this kind of stuff for color theory. And then in 2001 to 2007, they did the kind of bubble, stylized, shadowed, 3D, Apple logo. And then we get to the 2007 to present logo-ish. It's changed, actually. There should be one more edition of it. It's flattened out a little bit, not quite as much 3D, because when they did iOS 7 and then iOS 8, they need the flattened version. But anyway, that's trend. So you see this progression of logo, but once they got off this one, right, this became a very iconic logo that can follow them through 40 years, right? And so that's one of the big things that you want to think about when you're designing a logo is how does it withstand that timetable, okay? So in terms of the logo design process, right, it's going to start with a design brief, right? Today you're making up your own brief because you're doing your own logo. But if somebody came to you and said, I want a logo, right, you'd have to tell them, okay, well, tell me about your company. Tell me what, you need that basic information. Then you'd go out and you do research. And that research would give you what else is out there, what's appropriate, that sort of thing, right? You're going to go to reference, or what are competing markets doing, right? This should sound very familiar. We've talked about this same sort of thing before. Then you're going to do a bunch of sketching and conceptualizing and try to make it into an actual logo. Then you'll reflect on it. You'll show it to other people, get their impressions of it, and then finally you'll present it to the client, right? And so sometimes they're just kind of different and unique, right? This is a pretty good bubble diagram of kind of how this process works. Obviously there's a lot of overlap, but it's the same thing that I just talked to. About brief, research, reference, sketching is kind of conceptualizing is the biggest piece, right? Reflection, revisions, presentation, delivery, and finally support. Okay, so let's talk about how you might have created a logo, right? And this is a logo example. So they started in this example with a photograph, right, of the fist, and they said, okay, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to make this into a logo? So they started sketching. Okay, and so this works. Right, kind of in conceptual form, but it's not iconic enough. It's a little bit too detailed. So let's abstract it a bit more. Again, in sketching, right, simplifying it down into more basic shapes. Right, continuing to simplify down into more basic shapes. Again, still in the sketch phase. Right, then they move into Illustrator and they start to play around with the shapes and getting the shapes to line up. Right. Do a little bit of adjustment, a little bit of rotation, right? A little bit more of an overlap, and we get to the final logo, right? So it's an abstract from the photograph all the way through the process into the final logo. They're going to add a little bit more, to add a little bit of text, for example. Again, text choice. We'll talk about font in just a second. It's critical. And then we start to see it in context, right? And so here's an example of kind of the finished color version of the logo, a grayscale version, and also a black and white version. So you want to think in grayscale, color, and black and white, how repeatable is it, right? Because there are going to be things that are just in black and white. Full set of letterhead business cards, right? How does the logo work on that variety of sizes, right? So design brief if you're trying to develop it, this is what you're going to do today. You want to question your client, or in your case today, yourself, right? What is this logo going to be used for? Right? How are you going to use it? Right? Those kinds of questions are relevant. Okay? Be certain to include where you think it's going to be used. Is it only going to be used online? Are you going to make a t-shirt out of it? Right? Those kinds of questions. Right? It's also a good time, if you're doing it for somebody else, to talk about how much is this going to cost. Right? Because people always want to know kind of what's the budget and that sort of thing. Then you're going to do a bunch of research. Right? What other logos are used in the industry? Right? Are you going to use this on your personal landing page? Is this an architectural logo? What looks appropriate? Right? What else are people doing? What's creative that's out there? And how can you use those as inspiration? Right? What's the history of your previous logos? So for example, if you took 130, you probably had to do a logo in 130. Did you like it? Did you not like it? Should you spin off of that? Should you start fresh? Is it like the original Apple logo where you really need to drastically change, or do you just need to improve on it into something that you can use further along? What are your competitors doing? Right? You've seen other people's logos. What do they look like? Right? Look at other student logos. What do they look like? Right? Then you go into reference. Right? So what are successful logos? What are iconic that are out there? What makes them successful? Right? What are the current trends? Right? So for a long time there was a trend where things were starting to get 3D, they were a little shiny, right? That sort of thing. And it kind of reflected what was happening in phone applications, right? If you looked at the screen of your phone and you looked at the icons, they were all slightly bubbled and slightly shiny, right? And then iOS 7 came out because Apple was the first big company to take a stance, a design position on we're going to go back to a flat design. Things stopped having their shadows, they stopped having their shine, and they went back to being flat. So those are trends, and you want to be aware of that as you're designing these. Right? Then you move into sketching and conceptualizing. So you're going to go through a bunch of ideas in your head or on the back of a sheet of paper. Right? Try to sketch out what's going on, what seems right. Right? Fall back on your research and reference steps. What have you done? What have you seen? How do they fall into place? Right? You want to produce a bunch of ideas, right, as you're playing through this, because you don't know what's the right one. This is kind of that intuition phase, right, where you're just trying to go for it, give yourself a bunch of ideas, and then you can start to distill down as to what's really working, right, and start to enable this as an actual logo. Right? So here's a conceptualization. This is an improvement on these logos, right, as they move forward. The wave, these are done in Illustrator. Again, then they're applying gradients, right? And you can kind of see the shadowing, the subtle shadowing that's happening there. Then they go through and pick a variety of fonts. They're trying 3 different fonts. Okay, Avant-Garde, Futura Heavy, Century Gothic. If we look at these 3 fonts, they're very close to one another, right? They look almost identical, but the fact that they're going through and looking at each of these fonts is telltale for what details matter. Right? So they're really trying to be careful about what font and which one looks right. Right? Once they pick one, they're going to actually make it a live set of objects so that they can manipulate it. I'll show you how to do that today. Right? And you end up with the final logo. But remember, we also have to think about what does this logo look like if it's just in grayscale or black and white? How does it translate? So we have the very colorful logo with the gradients, right? And then the black and white version, they added a few little lines here to still give the 3-dimensionality to the black and white version. So you want to be aware of those kinds of subtle changes as well. Then you want to step back from your work, reflect upon your work. Does it look the way you want it to look? Right? What could you do to be making it better? This is a great time to lean over to your neighbor, and I actually specify as one of the steps in your exercise today that you have to ask your neighbor what they think. Right? I'm going to force you to talk to your neighbor. Okay? So you need to check with your neighbor, get some feedback, because that feedback is really critical, right? And it's going to help guide you in your process, right? Get that feedback, think about it, make some changes, right, and move forward. Right, I love this one. This is one of my favorites.
Is it rabbit?
Grab it.
Oh,
It's 2 hands with a rabbit, but it kind of works together, right? The best logos have these kinds of plays. Right, so there's a rabbit inside. The 2 hands are grabbing, but it's grabbing the rabbit. Grab it. I don't know. It's kind of fun, right? This is a Japanese beer, but it's a very iconic kind of logo. It's fun to see how it plays through, both in its bottle form, but then also in the business card form. Right? Then you get to the presentation stage where you're going to present to whoever your client is. In this case today, you're presenting to yourself. But you would be presenting to a client and talking to them about, here's the design options. This is what I think is the right direction to go. This is the Mall of America logo. And one of the things that they've done a great job thinking about is, how does this unpackage itself? It's the same basic vocabulary, but how can you use the same logo kind of in a few different ways? There's seasonal differences, 4th of July, Christmas, those kinds of things. So how does the logo change for those kinds? These are like background patterns that they could use on walls and that sort of thing. So they're thinking more than just the single logo. How does it extend out? You want to learn from others, right? What brands are successful? If I was to argue for what is one of the most successful logos of all time, it would be this, right? Everybody knows the Nike swoosh, right? I think the word swoosh came out of this somehow, right? This is Nike, right? No text, nothing else. It's about as simple as it can possibly get, right? It's this one little check mark, and that's it. Yet we all, brand recognition, would know this in an instant. Right? It's very, very obvious. So that makes it extraordinarily successful. Right? Typography, on the other hand, while we just went from the Nike logo, no text whatsoever, right? Typography is really important, and there's a lot of logos that are based solely on type, right? Solely on text, or variants of text. And so it's important, while you can create something completely iconic that doesn't need text, a lot of them do need text, right? So what is the right font? Picking the right font is critical, right? A lot of times designers end up making their own font just for the letters that are in the logo, because it's so critical, right? Will the font go out of style, right? We've talked about Papyrus being hugely popular in 2001 to 2003, and now when you go back to it, you say, oh my God, that's so 2001, right? It's just something to be aware of, that fonts have a timetable on them. Right? Some fonts kind of withstand the test of time and are fine long term, but you want to be aware of that, right? Does the font accurately represent the client, right? Is it appropriate? If you were doing a logo for an architectural design firm and they did all modern buildings, would it be appropriate to use Times New Roman? Probably not. Right? Would you pick Helvetica or something like that that's a sans serif font? Absolutely. So you want to think about what's appropriate for that particular company or business that you're designing for, right? For you guys, remember, you can load custom fonts. You can find custom fonts. It's worth your time investigating. I'll show you a couple websites today that you can look for to get some free fonts, right? The little details really, really matter. If you just have 2 or 3 letters, how those letters combine, how much space between them, tracking, kerning is absolutely critical. Right? Because you have to get those dialed in, because you don't have a lot of letters, right? You might have one name and that's it. And so all the spacing stuff is really important. So let's look at some examples of type-based logos, right? All of these don't have any shapes, nothing else. It's just the name and the font, okay? So IBM, very classic, right? Coca-Cola, also very classic. Right? Again, completely different fonts, but that's something that we're going to recognize, right? CNN, completely just a font. That's it, right? Disney has their stereotypical font, right? You can download Disney type fonts if you want to repeat Disney, but it's again this is Disney, right? NASA is also iconic like that. And then we get to FedEx, right? Which is, I think, one of the best logos, and I'm going to show you why. Right? It is purely type-based, right? Unless you look really carefully, and I'm going to change, anybody, if you haven't seen this before, I'm going to change this logo permanently for you, okay? Oh, there's an arrow right here.
Oh my gosh.
Right? And so most people don't see the arrow, but it is very distinctly designed around that arrow, right? Federal Express, it's an arrow, it's an express, right? And they very subtly put that arrow in there. So, for those of you that haven't seen that before, now every time you look at FedEx, you're going to see it differently. Okay? So it's very subtle, type-based, but really, really well done. Okay, so then we can get to some of these other ones. I have no idea what dynamic dust is or does, but it's kind of neat. It's a combination of typography, and at the same time, it's a combination of that background imagery, right? I think this is a very classic, clean logo, Oklahoma Contemporary, very type-based, right? This firm obviously does something kind of in a modernist sense, but I don't know what it is, right? So the other thing that we have to do is we have to avoid any of the cliche type things, right? Don't use clip art. If it's clip art, everybody else under the sun uses it, right? One of the stereotypical small business things, right, is that they always pick some clip art from Word and they put it on their letterhead and it always looks the same. It's always ugly. So if you're a global company, don't use a globe, right? Don't use the world, any of that kind of stuff. I think the only company that kind of semi-successfully does that is AT&T, and they've stylized away the bulk of the globe so that you don't even really see it anymore, right? So no light bulbs for ideas, none of that kind of stuff, right? Get rid of those preconceptions. They're not going to work, right? The other thing is you can't copy somebody else's logo, because if you copy somebody else's logo, it'll look exactly like their logo and it won't work as your logo, right? So you have to be aware of that sort of thing as well. When we get to the actual output sizes, right, we're looking at a PNG that's 1500 by 1500, 300 DPI. This is kind of your print quality. You can always scale down from that, but this is kind of the base level. If you're going to do web logos, 800 by 800 at 72 is kind of the standard. Again, you're going to scale down from that, but you want to create these standard pieces. The icons that are in the very upper corners of websites, the little tiny squares, right, are 16 pixels by 16 pickles. Pickles. They're 16 pickles by 16 pickles, right? Yeah, no, they're pixels, right? 16 by 16. They're called fav icons, and they're really tiny. But if you can interpret your logo into that size, it's a good thing as well, right? You of course always want to save your Illustrator file, your .ai, because you want to go back and make some edits or that sort of thing. You can also go back and re-export if you need it larger. Think black and white, grayscale, and color, right? Because you're going to have a variety of outputs long term, right? And so we'll show a bunch of examples of pieces. This one's kind of creative. There's a lot of extra stuff in the background that I don't like, but I like the symbolic paperclip with the cloud and how those two work together. It's kind of nice. This one's very clean. Cube, right? Dynatable, I don't know. I have no idea what these companies do, but it's kind of entertaining, right? The Eco Egg, right? And that one's whatever, right? I like this one, Fox Steady. It's kind of fun, right? The Fitness Refinery, right? Another bunch of very iconic logos again, right? CBS Eye, right? Clean Cans, right? I like this one, Leap Startup. It's pretty good, right? And then one more before we move into the world of Illustrator, conceptualization to final logo, right? This was for a company called Jigsaw Internet. These are the early sketches for how does this stuff come together, what do they look like, and that sort of thing. They did a preliminary logo, right, with kind of this 3D look, right? This would have been kind of trendy in about 2002-ish, right? Font-wise, it's about 2003, okay? But they needed to kind of adapt it, right? So they go much cleaner font. This is much more current in terms of iOS, thinner lines, that sort of thing. Grayscale, 2 puzzle pieces, right? And then they move it a little bit forward here. I actually prefer this version of it myself, but they move it forward with a little bit bolder, and then they're using the A to have the 2 puzzle pieces, right? But then I think their business cards are really pretty clever, right? Where you've got the puzzle piece that's on one side of it and that sort of thing. So you want to think through the whole process, okay? So we're going to switch now over into Illustrator, and I hopefully will show you some new stuff. Okay, so we're in the world of Illustrator, and we're going to start with a document that's 1500 by 1500 pixels. So I'm going to go ahead and go to New, and it's going to bring up the New Document dialog box. If I can type. This is going to be for print, and I'm going to specify that my size is 1500 pixels by 1500 pixels. And I'll go ahead and say that they have, oops. I'm going to switch to pixels, right? And I'll go ahead and say OK. And I get my nice little square. Okay. So what we're going to do thus far, you're now all experts in the pen tool, right? But I want to show you kind of how you can combine shapes and how you can work with shapes, because now we're going to be working with multiple shapes. And so you can create these shapes, obviously, with the pen tool. I'm going to start with the pre-made shapes to kind of show you, but you can customize as you go. So we have the basic rectangle, so I'm going to work with a couple overlapping rectangles for right now. So I'll create a rectangle here, and again, what I'm creating doesn't really matter just yet. I just want to show you some of the techniques, and then we'll get into it a little bit more. Right now it has a black stroke and a white fill. I want to change that so that it has a black fill and no stroke for right now. And then let me create another object. We'll do a rounded rectangle this time, something like that. And let's change the color. Sure, it can be pink. Why not? All right, so what I have is I have these two rectangles that are currently overlapping. If I wanted to start to combine these, I have a set of tools that can really help me work with these. And so what we're going to look up here is something called the Pathfinder tools. It's under Window and then Pathfinder. Right? And you could choose the docket if you want, or it can be floating. And at the top here, we have a couple options. We have something called shape modes, right? And then we also have what are called pathfinders. And all of these work slightly differently, right? The first one here under shape modes is going to combine the two shapes together, right? So if I have two shapes that I've drawn and I want those to combine together, I can select both shapes, right? And I held down Shift to do it. And then I can click on the shape mode that says Unite. And when that happens, I get one shape that is both of them together. Right, so I'm adding two shapes together. I'm going to press Control Z to go back. Right, I can subtract, right, minus front, right, which is basically saying take the one that's in front and subtract it. So if I click on that, we're going to take the one that's in front and subtract it out of the one that's behind. Right, so you can see how these start to combine together very easily. Control Z to undo. Right, this one is going to be intersect, so it's going to give me just the intersection of the two shapes. Right, I end up with just that intersection. And the last one here is going to be take the intersection and get rid of that. So there's the minus the intersection. Right? So you see it's really easy to start to combine these shapes together, and you can see where these would translate very naturally to logos. Right? The next set, which are called pathfinders, will actually give me three separate objects. So if I click on divide, right, I can then select each of these on an individual basis. They're currently grouped, so let me go into the direct select so I can select them one at a time, and you can see that each of those is now a separate object. Right? So they do something slightly different. This here would be trim, which is a slightly different variant on this. Instead of, let me back up one more step so that I end up with my two shapes. There we go. If I were to take these two objects and do this one, instead of dividing evenly, it's going to divide where one is in front. Right, so that one's in front and this one's behind. So it didn't divide the center as a separate piece. Right, this one is merge. Wait, I think I'm back on. We'll merge, and it's going to make them one compound object. I think I missed a step. Anyway, this is going to give us the intersection of the two, etc. So you can play around with these as you go forward. Generally, the shape modes are the ones you're going to use. The nice thing about this is we can start to combine shapes that don't necessarily work together. So for example, if we had, get rid of these for a second, oops. Right, if we had a circle, like this, and we wanted to take away something out of this side of it, right, we could draw another shape. Use the pen tool. Something like that. I'm just going to change the color so we can see it a little bit better. Right, so I have two shapes like that. I could take these, right, again use the Pathfinder or the shape modes to subtract the front, and I end up with this little piece. Right? Then I could add, obviously I'm playing around, right? I could add something else, and sure, I could do something where this is a separate object than this, and I could end up grouping them together, but it's actually better in practice to use the Pathfinder tools to subtract, because when I do that, this is transparent, and if I were to put another object behind it, send it to back here, right? It's going to shine through on that particular object. So instead of having a circle, right, that has a color in it, this is now a transparent object where whatever I put behind it is going to show through. Does that make sense? So it's better in practice. Okay? So you work to create whatever this logo is, right? Maybe it needs to have something else behind it. Right? So we'll do something behind it. Let me arrange, send to back. Obviously it needs a different color. I have no idea if that's the right color, right? And so we end up with a combination of objects that potentially are working together. Now sometimes we want a little bit of text to show up with those. And so first off, we have a bunch of text that's available on these computers, but it might not be the text that you want. Last class you learned how to load your own custom fonts, so now you don't have to do your own custom font, but you can find them. And so there's a bunch of websites out there. If you Google free font, right, there's a bunch of websites that are out there. Font Squirrel is the one I tend to use, where you can actually go through and find a bunch of fonts that might be useful to you. So maybe I like this one. I can download it, right? And I can, let me show it in the folder. Let me go ahead and extract it to my flash drive. Oh, and I apologize, I don't have my flash drive, so it's going to go on the desktop today. And I need that font viewer, so let me go ahead and get that really quick. Love it. Gotta love advertisements, right? Alright, so let me extract this to the flash drive as well. That was just to wake you all up, right? Let me extract it to the desktop. Let me go ahead and open this. Yes, you can go ahead and run. There we go. And let me load in that font that I just downloaded. There it is, right? Install it temporarily. Yes. All right. And now, when I jump back into Illustrator, I'll be able to use it. Now, the only problem here is sometimes on these computers, I have to restart Illustrator before I can actually use the font. So let me go ahead and save my work as an AI. Right? And let me save it on the desktop. Save. generally you want this. I haven't finished with the text and everything, so give me a little bit more time to get there. Sorry, I have to close Illustrator and then open it again. All right. So sorry, that took a second. But now, right, I could go ahead and in Illustrator I can go ahead and type in and let me change the font. Right there. And then let me jump up the size here. Alright, point being I can use a different font. Now, I'm going to pull this up a little bit and I'm going to put this inside here. Right? Let's go ahead and center this. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, I really don't like this font, but whatever. Right? So it may take a few times to get the right font. So there it is. Right? Now, I'd really like this to be live objects instead of, because I'd like to manipulate them a little bit. There's a way to do that. If we go to Type, and then we say Create Outlines, it will actually create a set of lines from the text, right? Which I can then use in combination with this object and the Pathfinder to subtract, and I can end up with a subtraction such that those are now cut out of the background. Right? Let me go ahead and take this object and send it to back again. Right? Now I want this to get bigger, so I've got that together as one. Let me go to my transform tool, and we'll make it as close to the size of the 1500 by 1500 as we can. Something like that. It's probably fine to have a little bit of extra space around it. Right, something like that. So, the other factor here is I've just picked these colors completely at random, but there is a bunch to color theory and how colors go together. Probably this combination of colors would not be the right choice. But what we can do is there's a website, and we're going to talk about this at length next class, but I want to at least show you ahead of time. There's two websites. Paladin is one of them that will help you color scheme. So we could pick a triad where we pick a primary color and then we end up with secondary colors that go with that primary color. Right? So depending, you can see how those colors change. Right? Colored is also one where they'll pick, they do it based on photos and hues that are in photos, but they have pretty good combinations such that you could pick from a set of colors. So if I like this one, for example, and I liked this blue, and I like kind of this tan, right? I can look and see what the RGB values of these colors are. You're supposed to be able to export these. Paladin works much better at the exports than Color does. Some images on Color do export, some don't. However, right, because we know basic information about this, we can actually write down RGB values, right? So that first one was 34, 53, 60. Right? And the next one here, I think is this one. 222, 162, and 108. And I'm just writing these down. And what I can do is I can jump back into the world of Illustrator, and I can go to, say, this object here, double click, and you see how we've got HSB, and then we've got RGB, and then we've got CMYK. Right? I can type, because I selected RGB, I can type in the values of RGB. So this is 34, 53, and 60. And that then matches the color, right, that was on that website. There it is. And then I can take this object, and it was 222, 162, and 108. Oops. Right, and I can say OK. And now I have a set of colors that are slightly more compatible than the colors that I originally picked. Okay? So I'd encourage you to play around with that a little bit as you go through in your particular logo. The other things that can happen is that maybe you want a little bit more depth to something like this. So I could take this image, I can copy it, I can go edit, paste in place, right, which gives me an exact copy. This time I'm going to give myself an outline, and I'm going to outline it with this color that I just picked. So 222, 162, and 108. And then I'm going to shrink it slightly. And I can do that in a couple different ways. One, I can use the free transform tool and just select and make this a little bit smaller. I'm holding down shift to keep it in proportion. Right? But what I'm trying to do is make this a little bit smaller like that. One of the challenges here is going to be to make it fit within the context of what I want. If this isn't working for you, you can obviously do something slightly different from this. Let me thicken up the lines here. All right. Let me get that piece approximately correct. That works. And then I'll make some adjustments. So I'll take this out there. So the point being, once you have the initial setup, you can do some enhancements to improve the overall appearance of whatever this logo is that you've created. Something like that. And give yourself a little bit more, right? This one actually probably should be a little bit bigger. Sorry. All right, perfect. So anyway, the point being that you can play around with it, add a little bit more depth to it. What I just entered is something called image isolation mode. And just what happened was I had a compound path. This and this were connected to each other. They're part of the same group or same compound path. I wanted to edit one of these separate and apart from the other one, so I double-clicked on it. It took me into this image isolation mode inside of the compound path, and it's going to let me move one piece separate from the other piece. Anyway, you may find yourself in that from time to time. Anyway, so once you've created the logo and you're happy with it, right, you're going to go ahead and export this. Remember, we talked about different export sizes, so I'm going to go to export, save for web will give me the web version, and I'm going to specify a width and a height, right? Well, it was 800 by 800. Alright, it was a PNG. There it is. Alright, looks pretty good. I'll go ahead and click save, and that'll be this first logo. Save, there. Then I'm going to export the print version, so I'll go File. Instead of Save for Web, I'm going to do File Export. There it is. And I'm going to pick PNG. And we'll do this dash 1500. I'll click Save. And here, I wanted it to be 300. The size is already 1500 because I specified that originally. And then I can go ahead and say OK. And that creates the 1500. Okay? So, play around today with the Pathfinder. Play around with the creating objects from type. Right? Give yourself several different logo experiments. Then talk to the person next door and ask what they feel is working best for you. Yeah.
Converting text to a path.
Okay, if you have text and you want to convert it to a path, let me just type something here. Right, and we want to convert it. You type it, select your font, get it the right size. After that, you're going to go up to type, and you're going to say create outlines, and that then creates a live object of it. Right? This works just like any object where I can make it bigger. Right? Because it's just like a set of paths that are defining this particular object. Okay? Sound good?
Yes.
All right. So I will turn you loose on this. I can't wait to see it. It's always really fun to see what people come up with, right? Remember, you already know the pen tool, so you don't have to stick with the basic shapes, but consider using the Pathfinder to combine the various shapes that you draw together. All right? Question? Okay, I'm coming.